seminar, summer seminar, but we did that to where other churches could come. I did a Thursday, Friday, Saturday seminar on church history. And so, rather than have that kind of a seminar this year, we're just doing a Sunday morning series, but it's kind of a seminar series, which of course we're taping and putting up online. And our series is based on history is His story. In the Gospel of John chapter 1, it begins in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Verse 14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory. And so the reference here to the Word is a reference to Jesus Christ. That is a title given to Him. Over in 1 John chapter 5, he says there's three that bear witness in heaven. God the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. These three are one. So identifying Jesus Christ, the second person of the Godhead, as the Word. And so the Word was in the beginning. In Revelation 1, and verses 1 through 8, we won't read all of that, but verse 8, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is, which was, and which is to come, the Almighty. So he says, I am the beginning and the ending. And so history, the history of mankind, from creation to the consummation of all things, is the story of Jesus Christ. And that is our theme that we are going to be studying, His story. History is His story. So kind of bear with us. We have the same opening, each one, to get us on track with where we are. We showed this chart that we have. In Peter, he said 1,000 years is as one day, and one day is 1,000 years. And it's a reference to God is not slack concerning His promise to come back. His promise to return, His promise of the millennial kingdom, and those things, the consummation of all this is according to a plan and a purpose that God has already established. He's not playing it by ear as He goes along. It is all planned out. And so there are those that believe, and I think this even goes back to Barnabas, one of the writings. It's not part of the New Testament canon, but one of the letters that Barnabas wrote, and I've read it. It's preserved, translated into the English, but he's one of those that believe this, that the creation week, not only is it a pattern for the week that recycles, that we follow, but it also is the pattern of God's eternal purpose in dealing with mankind. That in 6 days He created the heavens and the earth, and then on the seventh day He rested, and then on the eighth day the cycle starts over. That's the first day of the next week. And so as we look at that, if each day is 1,000 years, it was 4 days or 4,000 years to Christ. Then this present time, we believe, is another 2,000 years. That's 6 days. The seventh day He rested. That is the millennial kingdom, which is going to be 1,000 years. And then what comes after that? Well, the first day of the new week. That's eternity. It's an eternal day. It never ends. The cycle kind of ends with that as it begins that 8th day. And actually there's references in the Scripture, and it says in the 8th day was, and he mentions there in one of the feasts, it talks about the 8th day, and the 8th day was a Sabbath day as well. Was treated as a Sabbath. So anyway, as we look at that this morning, we're in the first lesson. We covered the first 2,000 years, the first half of the Old Testament. Today we're going to be covering the next 2,000 years. The people of God. And this is interesting because in Matthew, the first chapter, verse 17, he goes through the genealogy to Jesus Christ. And he begins with Abraham, and that's where we're picking up. So from the creation to Abraham was 2,000 years. And now, and it sums this genealogy up in verse 17, Matthew 1:17. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David unto the carrying away into captivity are 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ is 14 generations. And so that's kind of the breakdown. And so that's what we're going to use as our outline this morning. From Abraham to David. We'll look at the patriarchs, Moses and the tabernacle and the period of the judges. David to the captivity. We will look at Saul and David, Solomon and the temple and the kingdom divided. And then the captivity to Christ, we'll look at the corruption and that led to the captivity, Daniel and the prophecy of the 70 weeks of years and the Gentile world powers. That is our outline that we want to cover. So as we look at the first one, from Abraham to David, having divided mankind into family groups there after the flood, the Tower of Babel, we saw that this was Satan's attempt to try to draw all mankind together into a single entity and to worship him. Nimrod was his instrument in doing this, and the building of the tower, the ziggurat, which was a temple, a place of worship. God came down and confounded the language. And if you read that, study that, it was by certain family groups, the descendants of Japheth and the family groups under him, and of Shem, the different family groups there, Ham, the different family groups there. And he confounded their languages, and they began to scatter, because the family groups that spoke the same language stayed together, obviously. But they scattered out and founded their own little civilizations, and various civilizations began to arise. So some time has lapsed from that, but now we see certain civilizations have come up, have developed, have settled in the lands, and this is when God calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, and begins to deal with him and through him to create a particular people to himself. And so we see the corruption came through, just because you destroy everything, mankind, since the fall, human nature was corrupted by sin. And as long as there's a human being, there's going to be that corrupt human nature. And we see that even after the flood. Here's Noah and his 3 sons, their wives, 8 people, yet that corrupt nature is still present in mankind. And we see it permeating that society after the flood. And as they are scattered, we pointed out from the Babel, in their different languages now, they carried that impression that had been made on them at the Tower of Babel, that Nimrod and his wife Semiramis, she's not mentioned in the scriptures, but she's mentioned a lot of historical references and things going back to that period of time. And the worship that they were creating there, the names have changed, but the key features of that, and that's the reason with all these different religions around the world, the different temples, whether it be in India or Mexico or South America, Egypt, Babylon, they had a similar pattern. And they were copying that which they carried that memory with them as they went out. They began to settle and establish their own kingdoms and things. That corruption that was present and the deities. There's such a similarity across all of these, what we think of as heathen or pagan religions, the idolatry and worship. There is a similarity. They're different, but they're similar. And so to counter this, God is creating a people for Himself, to establish them in the world as a repository of truth, to be a witness to the other nations. And so, this is one of the things we see here when He calls Abraham in Genesis chapter 11. And then notice in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Deuteronomy chapter 7 verses 6, 7, and 8. This is what God says of the people. Of course, this is somewhat down the line from Abraham, but this is the people that are descendant of Abraham, what God says. He said, "For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto Himself above all people that are upon the face of the earth. The Lord did not set His love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people. But because the Lord loved you, and because He would keep the oath which He had sworn unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondmen from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." So because He loved them and had covenant with Abraham, He said, in thee, in thy seed, He made this covenant. And so that was the purpose here in creating a people unto Himself. We see in Hebrews chapter 11, it says, "By faith Abraham." And so, again, we see a consistency as to the character or characteristics, if you will, of the people of God. Whether it be, going all the way back to Abel. By faith, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. We see Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And he was moved by faith. He's mentioned here also in Hebrews, the 11th chapter. And so we see Abraham, verse 8, Hebrews 11:8. About 7 it says, mentions Noah, for by faith Noah, being warned of God. Verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. And so we see the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, his son Joseph. These are the patriarchs, the forefathers. But because of the promise and the covenant began with Abraham, he is calling out and creating a people for himself. And so we see here with Abraham and his sons, through whom the promise, the covenant was made, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and many times they refer to God in that lineage as far as relationship of the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, to God. Their God is the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. They're mentioned because these are the ones that God had made His covenant with, and through whom He's fulfilling that covenant. So as we read, and the thing is, this 2,000 years, the first 2,000 years, we covered that with just a few chapters of the book of Genesis. This next 2,000 years, there is a lot of history that is recorded in the Scriptures. And of course, we can't go into detail and hope to try to cram this all in one lesson. But what I want us to see here is the overarching God, Jesus Christ, dealing with these people. He is the promised Redeemer. And as we see the worship of God is centered around that promise and faith in that promise. And the offerings and the sacrifices that are brought picture that promise. The atonement, the blood of those sacrifices of the animals and things that was offered there was an atonement to cover their sins for the time being, until the true Lamb of God, the true sacrifice would come, and His sacrifice would be made, His blood would be shed, and that sacrifice would take away all sin forever. And it was faith in that promise. And so as we read about these things, or we touch upon these, keep that in mind. And at the same time, Satan is corrupting that worship and directing it away from God to himself in one way or another. And this is the constant through all this history that we will be touching upon. That corruption and the process. It goes through this cycle that Paul reveals to us in Romans chapter 1. And without going through and reading all that every time, but by faith Abraham sojourned in the land, said, dwelling in tabernacles or tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. And so it goes on. It says, by faith Isaac, and then by faith Jacob blessed both the sons of Joseph. By faith Joseph. And so he lists these Abraham and his direct descendants, that lineage. By faith. And so we see that at the time of Joseph, there was a time of famine, how God provided and put Joseph there in Egypt. I mean, his brethren meant it to him for harm, but God had intended that for good. And God's always working like that. I mean, He has a plan, and that's what Paul said in Romans. All things work together for good to those who love God, who are the called according to His purpose. And so Joseph, being sold by his brethren into slavery into Egypt, they intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. And He brought good about it from that. And He prepared a place for that family to be protected through this great famine, 7 years of famine that occurred. And so we see, He said, you was the least in number. When that family went down into Egypt, there were 70. Now this included Joseph, his wife, and his 2 sons, which he had in Egypt. And then his father Jacob and his brethren and their wives and children and everything. There were 70 of them that went down into Egypt. When they came out of Egypt, they numbered in the millions. Somebody has estimated there was something like 4 million people when you count all as it numbered the warriors. And for every warrior, you had a set of parents that was too old to fight. And you had some younger brethren that was too young to fight. Plus all their livestock and cattle. They think they numbered somewhere in the millions of people when they came up out of Egypt. God was making. He created from one man and his wife a nation. You're not a nation yet. When they come up out of Egypt, they're a mixed multitude. At Sinai, He gives them the law, the covenant, the 10 Commandments. And I find this interesting. There's a thought that came to me. that first of all Moses went up and he spent 40 days and nights there on the mountain, and God gave him the 10 Commandments. And I think it was more than just writing down 10 Commandments. How long does it take God to write down 10 Commandments? But I think he was instructing Moses in all the application, all the wisdom and things contained, embraced by those 10 Commandments. Because later we see he's set to judge the people. Every question they had, they came to him because he was the one that God had taught these things. But of course, while he was up there, the corruption of the people, they said, we don't know what's happened to Moses. You know, he's been gone so long, he might be dead up there. What are we going to do? They wanted to turn back and go to Egypt. And he said, make us gods. And so Aaron, gave in to the will of the people. They created the golden calf, and the people began to worship. So when Moses and Joshua are coming down from the mountain, they hear the noise, the celebration. They said, these be the gods that brought you up out of Egypt. So that corruption had already set in. Of course, the tablets of stone, Moses in his anger cast them down, broke them, which was a symbolic act, if you will, that man, here was this perfect law given to man, but they had already broken it. And that's an important distinction. Man has already sinned. By the time you grow up and you hear the 10 Commandments, if you're fortunate enough to even do that, to hear about God, to hear about the 10 Commandments, you've already broken them. You've already sinned. Those commandments can't do anything to save you. All they can do is condemn you. That's what was pictured there. It wasn't until after that act that Moses goes back up. He gets another table of stones, and God gives him the instructions for building the tabernacle. A way to establish the true worship of the true God, as opposed to the corrupting influences and how the rest of the world worship. God instituted a particular worship which it focused on the shedding of blood. The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. And so we see this being instituted at this time, and the giving of the tabernacle instructions. So they build the tabernacle and everything. He organizes them by tribe, by family, arranging them around the tabernacle, arranging their order of march. And so he creates an army. They went in 70 souls, a family, a tribe of 70 people. They come out a mixed multitude. At Mount Sinai, they receive the commandments, the covenant. God makes a covenant with them as his people, and he organizes them into an army. They're not a nation yet, but they're not this disorganized mixed multitude either. They're an army. They have their trumpet calls. They have their order of march. They have their responsibilities delegated to each one. And when the pillar, the cloud rises up, it's time to pack everything up. And then when it moves, you follow it. And they had their order of march. Of course, they came up to Kadesh. It didn't take them that long to get there. They sent in the 12 spies. 10 of them brought back an evil report. So we can't do it. We can't take this place. It's full of giants and walled cities and everything. It was Joshua and Caleb that said, no, God is it's a good land. It's just like God promised us. And God will defeat them. He will give us the victory. We just need to go in and take it. But the people were filled with fear and said no. And God said, okay. He said, you're going to wander here in this wilderness a year for every day you was in spying out the land. That's where the 40 years came from. They spent 40 days spying out the land. And God says, you're going to wander in this wilderness for 40 years. And that entire generation, from 20 years old and up, that was old enough to fight, that entire generation died in the wilderness. And it was their children that they used as the excuse. You know, what will happen to the children? What will become of the children? They were the ones who went in and conquered the land. With the exception, their leaders was Joshua and Caleb. Anyway, so they go in and take the land, and you have the period of the judges which followed. And so at first there was no king. They conquered the land. They didn't drive everybody out, but God said, now don't make any marriages, don't make any covenants, any agreements with the people of the land. You need to finish driving them out. And so, of course, they didn't follow that. Now there was a generation, that generation that was alive under Joshua, that generation that came in and took the land, they obeyed God. And that generation that outlived them, they obeyed God. But eventually there arose another generation that had no connection to that. It was not part of their life experience. And of course that's the generation then that began to go astray. And I think that's one of the reasons, the importance, and God says, you know, you teach your children, you teach your grandchildren. If you are able, you teach your great-grandchildren. Each generation needs to pass on to their generations following the things of God, the things that God has done for them, how God has blessed them. You know, the wisdom that we've gained from our parents and our grandparents that has come down to us. We need to ensure that that knowledge, that wisdom, those experiences are passed down. Not just the earthly experiences, but the spiritual wisdom and understanding needs to be passed down to our children and our children's children. Else, there's a generation. You know, they talk about this generational gap. Why? Because Satan has tried to make a divide there to separate a generation from its previous generations. And he's done this in many different ways. You know, in China and places, they erase the history, change the printed word, come up with a new alphabet so that all the old writings, everything, this generation of children coming up, and they're taught how to read and all in the schools, they don't know how to read that stuff. They lose that connection. You know, we see that in our society today in different ways. You go back a few generations. I remember when they came out with the new math, and I tried to get my dad to help me with my math. And I tried explaining to him. He just that doesn't make sense. You know, it kind of made sense, but why teach that when you have a math system that works? Why come up with something different and teach that to create a generational divide there, to where you don't communicate with the previous generation? You know, there's a lot of ways, and some of them are subtle, but but God has emphasized that with His people. And so we see that going on. And the judges, they come up, and when they would sin, we see this cycle. There'd be peace for a while, and then the corruption would set in. They would corrupt themselves, and God would strengthen the enemies, or at least one particular enemy there, and they would rise up and oppress the people. And finally the people had enough, and they'd cry out to God for help, and He'd raise up a deliverer. And He'd deliver them, and then they would have peace for several years. But then they'd go right back. That human nature. You know, and we need to learn from that, because we're dealing with the same tendencies, the same human nature in our culture today. And within our families. And within your own life. You know, how many times have, you know, you've gotten into a tight spot and everything, you're praying, God, just get me out of this, I'll be good. I promise you, I'm going to be good from now on. And He gets you out of it, and you're good for a week, 2 weeks, whatever, and then you go right back. Now, we're no different. And we face the same things. We go through the same cycles of life. And that was the period of the judges until they came down. Samuel was their judge. And they said, we've had enough of this. You know, your sons, they're not doing right by us and so on, and you're getting old. What we want is a king. We want to be like the other nations. We want a king that will lead us out and bring us in and tell us what to do. And Samuel knew that's not a good idea. And he goes to God and lays it out. And of course, and God tells Samuel, look, they haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. See, the bottom line is they was tired of how God was taking care of them. Well, the problem wasn't how God was taking care of them. The problem was their own sinful natures and desires that they kept giving into. That's what was getting them into trouble. And so God said, let them. And so their first king, you know, it's kind of like your kids keep wanting to do something. You say, no, you're going to get hurt. No, you're going to get hurt. No, you're going to get hurt. And finally you say, okay, I'm going to let you do it and you'll find out. And they do it and they get hurt. And then they learn to listen, maybe, for a while. And that's basically what God was dealing with them when He gave them Saul. He gave them the kind of king that they thought they wanted. He was tall, he was strong, he was good looking. I mean, he was, looking on the outward appearance, he was everything they thought a king ought to be. Except he was weak spiritually and morally. And you see how that went. And so then God gives them a king that He chose, David. And who is David? He was the least of his brethren. You know, he had several older brothers, big stout warriors. And he was the littlest one. He was the baby of the family. Yay for babies of the family. He was the baby of the family. He was small, he was ruddy complected, and so on and so forth. But he was the one that God chose. Because he was a man after God's own heart. He was humble. He was obedient. He was full of faith. And God made him king. And every king after him is compared to David. You just think about that. Every king afterwards is compared to David. Was David perfect? No, he was a human being. He had the same corrupt nature that you and I have and that all of his predecessors had. But he was still the best king the people of God ever had. And the Messiah is compared to David. The Messiah is the son of David. You know, when Jesus came and they was crying in the streets, Jesus, thou son of Solomon. Didn't say that, did they? Jesus, thou son of David. It was David's throne. That was the throne that God had established and promised that the Messiah one day would come and sit upon that throne. And so you have the period, then after Saul you had David. And David's desire was to build a house, a temple for the Lord, to replace the tabernacle. We're no longer wandering in the wilderness. We have a permanent home here. We're no longer, as a people, we're no longer dwelling in tents. We have our sealed houses and things. And God, we still leave Him over here in His tent. You know, a lot of times God blesses us and we move ahead, but we leave Him back here. David had a passion for God. And that was his desire. But God didn't allow him to build the house, but said his son would, Solomon. Solomon came, and Solomon started out really good. I mean, he prayed, the Lord said, give me wisdom to be able to lead so great a people as your people. And that pleased God. And he blessed him with wisdom, but also blessed him with peace. Had no wars to fight. It gave him the time and all, and blessed him with riches, gave him the time and the financial means to build the temple. And David had prepared a lot of that for him during his lifetime. But Solomon did not walk in all the ways of his father David. And it says that Solomon loved many women, many strange women, that is, foreign women. And as he must have been an obsessive compulsive, because he didn't just have one wife, he had many wives and concubines. And they turned his heart. The very thing that God said would happen. Not just to Solomon, but to anyone. Those commandments was placed when you don't make marriages, you don't take their wives to be, their daughters to be wives to your sons, you don't give your daughters in marriage to their sons. You're a holy people. You're to be a holy people to the Lord. And so, but Solomon, they turned his heart, and he built temples to their gods. He would go in and worship in their temples and offer sacrifices to their gods of his wives. And so forth. And God was angry with Solomon. He said, I'm going to take the kingdom from you, but not because of David. For David's sake, I'm not going to do it in your lifetime, but your son. So Rehoboam comes along, Solomon dies, Rehoboam, his son, becomes king, and the people come and ask him, look, your daddy really, we had a heavy tax burden. Would you please lighten our taxes? You know, how familiar is that? And the older counselors who had been there with David's father said, yes, you need to go along with the people. You submit to the people in this and they'll follow you. But the younger counselors, the ones that was his age, the peers, you know, the peer pressure, the peer advice. You know, if you want advice about life, don't go to someone your own age, because they don't have any more life experience than you do. You go to someone who has lived for a while and has survived, particularly someone who is successful, and you ask them. Don't ask your best friend at your age, because he doesn't know any more than you do, or she doesn't know any more than you do. But that's what Rehoboam did. And they said, oh, well, you're the king. You can do whatever you want to, you know. You tell them to go pound sand. That's a favorite phrase of Scott's. He said, just tell them to pound sand. You're the king. And so they separated. And that's where you have the kingdoms divided under Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who did make Israel to sin. And so the northern kingdom separated, and Jeroboam didn't. He was afraid, well, the people keep going back down to Jerusalem to worship. Their hearts will return to the king in Jerusalem, and I'm going to be out of a job. I like being king. So he made golden calves. Here we go again. Just like when they was at Mount Sinai, he made golden calves, made two of them, put one up in Dan, and he created his capital city there, Samaria, and put one there for the people to worship. And of course the priests of God, they wouldn't. So he made priests of the lowest sort. And from that time on, the northern kingdom never had a good king. Every king is kind of compared to Jeroboam. And some of them walked in the ways of Jeroboam, some of them were even worse. One of the worst was Ahab, because he married a foreign woman who was a priestess of Baal. I mean, she didn't just worship Baal, she was a priestess of Baal, and that was Jezebel. And so, the northern kingdom, every kingdom, they never had a good, godly king. They had some heroes, they had some people up there that God used to destroy a previous wicked king, but they didn't turn out to be much better. Whereas in Judah, you had godly kings up until Jehoshaphat. Now, Jehoshaphat overall was a good king, but he had a soft spot. And he said, you know, why can't we all just get along? And Ahab wanted him to come and help him in war. And Jehoshaphat said, well, your people are my people, we're the same family, you know. He said, sure. And so one of the things that's said about Jehoshaphat, he joined in affinity with Ahab. One of the worst kings that Israel had. And what does it mean he joined in affinity? He took the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel to be a wife to his son. Her name was Athaliah. She was as wicked as her mother Jezebel. When her husband died and her son became king, she ruled in his stead. I think when he was killed, she had all the other children put to death so that she could reign as queen. Except they snuck one out, the baby again, hid him away in the temple, and he was raised by the priest. But from that point on, because of the corruption that Athaliah and the influence that Ahab and Jezebel had through Athaliah upon the kingdom of Judah, they began to go downhill, and they began to walk in the ways of Israel and to worship those gods. So not only was Israel then taken away in captivity by the Assyrians eventually, but then we see Judah eventually falling. They followed the same corruption, the same path, the idol worship, and so on, that the predecessors said Jerusalem, every street, every place had a temple, had an idol, a shrine or something. It was filled with the high places and all places of worship to these other gods. And God said, I'm going to wipe it clean. Which he did. He raised up Nebuchadnezzar, came in, destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem, carried the people that weren't killed. Many of the children of the nobility was carried into captivity. The poorest of the people was kind of left behind to fend for themselves. And per the culture at that time, they would bring in a foreign people and settle them in the land. And that's what the Assyrians did when they conquered the northern 10 tribes. They left a few of the people behind, but they brought in a foreign people and settled them in that land, because you separate a people from their native land, then they're not as likely to rebel. It's a means of pacifying a land, an area. And this was what they did. But we see that one of the young men that was carried captive was a man by the name of Daniel. And so Jeremiah, who was he was an older person, but he overlapped the life of Daniel. Jeremiah the prophet was the prophet at the time that the children of Israel was taken into captivity. And so Jeremiah had written, God inspired him, and he said, you're going to spend 70 years in captivity. Daniel was familiar and had read, evidently had copies of it that he studied when they was there in Babylon. And of course, you know how God promoted Daniel, much like he had Joseph in Egypt. He promotes Daniel within the hierarchy, the wise men, the advisors and all, in Babylon. And Daniel was studying Jeremiah, and he said, 70 years. Let's see, we went into captivity. I was this age. I'm this age now. Wow, we've been here about 70 years. That means we're getting close to going back home. And he began to pray about it and seek God's wisdom. That's when God appeared to him. And in the book of Daniel, and Daniel is a pivotal book, especially when it comes to the end times. Daniel is key to understanding the book of Revelation. And so, whereas through Jeremiah, God had prophesied that they would be in captivity for 70 years. To Daniel, he gives a prophecy that from the time spoken of by Jeremiah, when the order is issued for you to return and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and everything, to the coming of the Messiah, and the millennial kingdom, and understand that that is a two-part prophecy. The first coming of the Messiah, first of all, to fulfill the promise given to Adam and Eve in the garden, given to mankind since the fall, that a Savior would come, a Redeemer would come. He whom Job mentions, that I know my Redeemer liveth. You know, he is alive right now, and one day he's going to stand upon this earth, and I will see him. And that's a reference to the resurrection. Said, even though I die and the skin worms devour my body, yet in my flesh with my own eyes I'm going to see him. That's the resurrection in the last day. But Job knew it, believed it. And so there's two things involved here. And so he says the prophecy is 70 weeks of years. That is 490 years. And I'm going to bring about the consummation of all things. In 490 years from the time that order goes out to rebuild, to the consummation or to the establishing of the millennial kingdom. Because this is a prophecy on the children of Israel and Jerusalem. Regarding the children of Israel and Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem, was 490 years. 469 years out of that total, he said, from the rebuilding that's going to be 62 weeks. Let me read it. Verse 25, Daniel chapter 9, verse 20. Know therefore and understand. Well, let me go back up. Where does it begin? Verse 24. 70 weeks, or 70 weeks of years, are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So that is the end. 70 weeks of years, 490 years, to bring that to pass. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. He divides it into two parts here. The street shall be built again and the wall even in troublous times. That's the 7 weeks. So the first part of that was from that order to the actual rebuilding was going to take 7 weeks. He said, but then 62 weeks, said in verse 20, and after 62 weeks, you've got the 7 weeks, now you've got the 62 weeks, or 62 years. Shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. and the people, the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so he says, after 69 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. That's his crucifixion. See, a lot of people say to Messiah the Prince, and so they're calculating, well, he was born in 4 BC. And you know, they're calculating to his birth. Some want to calculate to his baptism. But the cutoff that is given here in the prophecy is his crucifixion. And that's what throws people off a bit. But anyway, I have been going from memory, and not all my notes. But this prophecy of 49 years, then 434 years, 69 weeks, or 483 years from that until Christ was crucified, which is exactly, God fulfilled it exactly to the year. He didn't make any mistakes. He's a mathematician, or he's the source of our knowledge and understanding of math and calculus and all these things that we use to define our universe and everything. And so he's not off. And so we believe it's going to be another 2,000 years then to the finish. This is this gap in between that's not defined for us, because it doesn't reference the Jewish people or Jerusalem. It's a period of the Gentiles. And one of the things Daniel does, he talks about the Gentile world powers that will be in power till this is fulfilled. Who will be in power when Christ comes the first time as the Lamb of God to take away our sins, to offer himself as the sacrifice. He comes as the Redeemer. And then when he left, he promised to come back. But when he comes back, he's coming back as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He's coming back as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's coming back to take the throne of his father David, to sit on it and to rule and to reign here upon the earth for 1,000 years. And so Daniel lays much of this out for us in the prophecies and visions given to him, that gives us an understanding then when we get into the book of Revelation, which eventually we want to do in this study, at least touch upon some of these things as it brings to a close. And so through this period of time, we see that the corruptive influence of Satan and how he is working, constantly seeking to draw people away from God and away from the worship of the true God to himself. Because that's his desire, to exalt himself above God, above all that is worshiped, showing himself that he is God. And so the corruption in the world constantly turns men away from God. And if we're turning away from God, who are we serving? So the things the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And so that was one of the things, and as we look at this period, and the next thing is the promise of the Messiah. So all the sacrifices and instruction that God had given them was to keep before the people this vision of the Redeemer that is to come, that will take away their sins. And when, as those who've gone before, like Abel and Noah and Abraham, these who by faith offered a more excellent sacrifice. By faith they believed God and obeyed him. By faith. And so when they offered these sacrifices, the animal sacrifice, the blood could never take away their sin, but they offered it by faith because God had promised to send the Redeemer, the Savior, who would take away their sin. And so, the Lord willing, that's where we'll pick up next time, is, as he said there in the book of Hebrews, where it goes back and it's outlining all of this, which stood just for that time until the time of Reformation, or the fulfilling of it. And the very next line said, but Christ be come. That was the fulfillment. And Lord willing, that's where we intend to take up next time. So we will close here.